So I mentioned in my response to Ryan Holiday's 26 Rules for Reading for 2026 that one of the things he said that I disagree with is that if you want to understand a field, you should start out with the very earliest formative works on the topic. So if you want to understand biology, read Darwin. If you want to understand economics, read Adam Smith. And I made another video talking about that a little bit. But I wanted to actually talk about that more. And I actually tried to record a video on this a while ago I wasn't entirely happy with. Because I've seen this come up a couple of other places from two actually very different books by two very different people. So in the Almanac of Naval Ravikant, he basically says the same thing as Holiday, which is that you want to learn about evolution, start with Darwin, economics, Smith. And then Parvini is complaining that a lot of people have read Burnham's Machiavellians, but they haven't read Machiavelli, which if you want to be very pedantically technical, is not true of me, but I read part of The Prince in high school. I did not reread it, did not try to finish it after reading the Machiavellians, and I don't agree with him that it's necessary. And it's interesting because this advice from Holiday, from Ravikant, and from Parvini goes against what Kuhn said in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he said that nobody reads Darwin today because his ideas are, along with the new stuff we've developed, expressed much more succinctly in modern textbooks. And I think Michael Polanyi, who I've talked a lot about, also sort of made a similar point. And one of them, I think it was Polanyi, talked about how as scientific fields develop, they develop their own language and culture distinct to them that become harder to read. And like even reading textbooks depends on being able to sort of have a foothold in the culture to understand some of this stuff by osmosis, by watching how people do it. And so, as I mentioned, I read Darwin finally, and I had been saying people should read Darwin for a while because I've heard he's easy to read without actually doing it myself until a few years ago. And he is easy to read. And what's fascinating to me is, like, I've seen a lot of people claim that Darwin has basically been superseded. And I remember when I was in undergrad, like some of these claims people were making, I was like, I'm not sure that that's true. Like, it seemed like the evidence is going the other direction. And reading Darwin, I'm actually amazed by how much of what is sort of central to modern evolutionary theory is found in Origin of the Species. And yeah, there's some stuff he didn't get, and there's some stuff he was wrong about. But if you want to see how you develop this idea, because he was influenced by other people who had different theories of evolution, and also by Charles Lyell on geology and the age of the Earth. But it's still, natural selection is very different from other theories of how evolution works, and it's very counterintuitive. Kostler argued about it, which is something I will definitely want to talk about more. I think Kostler was partially right, although I think he also sort of strawmanned Darwin. So I definitely think it's worth reading Darwin, but I think it's worth reading Darwin after you've been exposed to modern evolutionary theory and the neo-Darwinian synthesis and where the state of the field is now, through classes, through textbooks. I would not necessarily say start with the Origin of the Species. And then Adam Smith is really interesting because, as I mentioned before, I'm reading him now, and it's this particular book, tiny, tiny text. It's actually a pretty hefty book normally. And the thing for me is just the chapters are long, and so I'm often slower going through books with longer chapters because I'm like, can I commit half an hour at least to... It's usually because I'm not sitting down for like just half an hour. I'm sitting down for like hour and a half, 2 hours, and so it's more like, am I going to be like halfway through a chapter when I need to get up? But anyways, this book, same thing. I'd heard it was easy to read, and I'd recommended people read it. And parts of it are, but parts of it, it's not that the language is difficult. It's that he references, I mean, there's some archaic language that doesn't use the way we do, but it's that he references historic events that, in some cases, I know about them, but I think most people wouldn't. And some of them I'm like, I don't even know what these events he's referencing are. But it is interesting reading some of the things he's saying, and I'm like, oh, he is actually anticipating things that other thinkers would develop much later, which is something you often see in, especially if you follow ideas backwards, which I recommended and I still recommend, is you'll see, oh, this idea that someone else developed was embryonic and talked about here, but wasn't, the implications were not fully developed in earlier works. So I think it's worth reading people like Darwin or Smith, but I think generally after you've been exposed to the modern thinking, and in the case of Adam Smith particularly, I think after you've read some of the, I think the term is neoclassical economics, the Chicago and Austrian school. I've read Chicago school. I haven't read any of the Austrian school yet, except for a little bit of Hayek. But having some idea of what these schools say, and you realize Smith anticipated a lot of what they said, and then the Chicago and Austrian schools basically developed arguments for a lot of what Smith said when you had other thinkers who came along and said, okay, Smith was incomplete. And so like with Darwin, although I think to an even greater degree, a lot of the, oh, Smith was wrong about stuff is questionable at best. And then when it comes to actually reading Machiavelli, I think it definitely makes sense to, after reading Burnham, to read some of the people he calls Machiavellians. And I mentioned I'm reading Pareto even more slowly than Smith, because like even longer chapters than Smith, and Mosca, and other people related, and some people Pardini also brought in as related to these people. But I read Machiavelli, part of The Prince, in high school. Burnham, if I recall, said that it was one of his other works that was more influential, that I want to read at some point. And it could be that I'll have the same thing where I'm like, oh wow, Machiavelli anticipated a lot of stuff that these later thinkers did. But Machiavelli was way earlier relative to the people who sort of built on his work or who Burnham groups with him than Smith and Darwin. And so if you're thinking again about Kuhn and like paradigm changes, I think there's a good case to be made that a lot of what Machiavelli articulated, he didn't even have the vocabulary for what later thinkers could. When I get to Machiavelli, I'll actually have commentary. But basically what I'm sort of getting at here is I think it is absolutely worth reading a lot of these foundational writers. I think it's worth doing it after you have a sense of where the modern state of the field is, and especially the controversies, because it's interesting. You'll often see that it turns out with Smith and with Darwin, it turns out a lot of stuff that people are saying they've been superseded. There are actually people who still defend their original position, and I find those defenses more credible. But it's the school who's like, oh, they're superseded because the original book didn't agree with us. It doesn't mean because the original person predicted it that the newer school that takes that position is necessarily right. But as someone who I'm finding that where there are these controversies in evolutionary biology or in economics, I'm tending to agree with Smith or Darwin where they seem to be clearly taking sides on them. So anyways, I wanted to talk about this quickly. Thanks for watching. I'm Magpie. This is Leela, and I'll see y'all in the next one.